A street sweeper fed a poor, crippled beggar every day, until he said, "I'm a billionaire." The sun was bleeding amber across Westport's old district, painting everything in that golden hour light that made even broken things look beautiful. Mary dragged her broom across the cracked pavement, each stroke sending up small clouds of dust that danced in the dying light. 35 years old, sweat sticking her hair to her forehead, but she kept moving. Always kept moving. This was her last street of the day, the forgotten one. The street where people only walked if they absolutely had to, if they were lost, desperate, or invisible, just like her. 10 years. 10 years of sweeping these same sidewalks, and the silence had become her closest companion. But Mary? Mary had never let the quiet steal her smile. She'd nod at the stray dogs, whisper, "Good morning," to the pigeons pecking at crumbs, even chuckle at the empty soda cans rolling in the wind like they were old friends sharing a joke. But today was different. At the far end of the street, tucked against the weathered brick wall of an abandoned storefront, someone was sitting, waiting. He was thin, the kind of thin that spoke of missed meals and hungry nights. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it had been stitched together from discarded pieces. A wooden crutch leaned beside him like a faithful guard, and his eyes followed her every movement like he'd been sitting there all day, just waiting for her to appear. Those eyes were hungry, not just for food, for something deeper. Mary didn't hesitate, didn't even pause to think about it. From her worn canvas bag, she pulled out her lunch, a simple sandwich wrapped in brown paper and a bottle of tea that had gone lukewarm hours ago. "Is this your lunch?" he asked, voice raspy like he hadn't used it in days. Mary crouched beside him, her knees creaking slightly. "I was going to eat this," she said, holding out the sandwich. "But you look like you need it more than I do." He stared at the food, then up at her face, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're not scared of me?" Mary laughed, a real laugh, warm and genuine. "You're sitting down, and I've got a broom. I think I can handle you." That made him smile. Just a little crack in his weathered expression, but it was there. As he unwrapped the sandwich with careful fingers, Mary settled beside him on the pavement, her broom resting against her shoulder. She began brushing the dust beside her feet with lazy, absent strokes, like she had all the time in the world. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, chewing slowly. "Daniel." "I'm Mary." And just like that, they started talking. Not like strangers meeting on a forgotten street, but like old friends who'd just remembered how to be human again. Mary told him about the funny things she'd seen that day. A businessman chasing his hat down 3 blocks, a little girl teaching her grandmother how to skip. Daniel listened with the intensity of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to another person. She stayed longer than usual. The sun dipped lower, shadows growing longer, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was something about Daniel, something that made her feel less alone in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Finally, as the streetlights began to flicker on, Mary knew she had to go. She stood, brushing dust from her uniform, and picked up her broom. But Daniel's voice stopped her. "Mary." His eyes were fixed on her face, serious now. "Why do you keep giving away your food, when no one gives anything to you?" The question hit her like a physical thing, settling in her chest with a weight she couldn't name. She looked down at him, this broken man wrapped in cast-off blankets, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. Then she smiled, the way she always did when questions got too big for her small world. "Because that's what people do," she said simply, dismissing the moment with a wave of her hand. But as she walked away, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's question would follow her home, would sit with her through dinner, through the quiet hours before sleep, through the dark spaces where her own hungers lived. Why did she give when no one gave to her? She didn't have an answer, wasn't sure she wanted one. Behind her, Daniel watched until she disappeared around the corner, his fingers still wrapped around the empty sandwich wrapper like it was something precious. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel became part of Mary's routine, like breathing. Work all day, sweep the streets, and at the forgotten corner where he waited with that same careful smile. She'd bring 2 lunches now, whatever she could manage. Sometimes it was just crackers and an apple, sometimes soup in a thermos when the nights grew cold, but always something. They'd sit together as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Mary found herself sharing things she'd kept buried for years. books she'd started but never finished because she was too tired, a little brother she hadn't seen since he moved to Portland, dreams she'd tucked away under the weight of bills and responsibility. But Daniel? Daniel listened too closely, asked questions that cut too deep. "Do you ever wonder what you gave up to survive?" he asked one evening, watching her face in the fading light. Mary's hand stilled on her broom. The question settled in her stomach like a stone. "What do you mean?" "Just the person you might have been, if things had been different." She was quiet the whole walk home that night, Daniel's words echoing in her head like a song she couldn't shake. That's when she started noticing things. Small things at first. A man in a dark coat standing across the street when she left for work, pretending to read a newspaper. The same man 3 days in a row, always just at the edge of her vision. Then a business card slipped under her apartment door. Heavy stock paper with no name, no number, just a gold symbol that looked like interlocking circles. At the shelter where she bought day-old bread for half price, Marcus, the volunteer she'd known for 2 years, wasn't there. Instead, a woman she'd never seen before handed her a free loaf of sourdough, winked, and said, "He told me you liked this kind." "Who told you?" Mary asked, but the woman just smiled and turned away. The bread was still warm. Mary's hands shook as she walked to Daniel's corner that evening. Something was happening around the edges of her small world, something that made her feel like she was being watched, studied, measured. "Who are you really?" she asked the moment she saw him, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Daniel looked up from the book he'd been reading. Where had he gotten a book? And smiled. But it wasn't his usual careful smile. This one was different. Faint. The way someone might smile at a dog barking at thunder. Patient, knowing, almost sad. "Don't worry, Mary," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "You'll know soon." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." Mary stared at him, searching his face for something she could recognize, something that felt true. But Daniel looked back at her with those same hungry eyes, and she realized she'd never really known what he was hungry for. That night, she barely slept. Every small sound in the hallway made her jump. Footsteps, doors closing, the elevator creaking. She kept thinking about the man in the dark coat, the business card, the way Daniel had said soon, like he was waiting for something specific to happen. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and made tea, sitting by her small kitchen window that looked out onto the fire escape. The city sprawled below her, millions of lights twinkling like earthbound stars, and Mary felt smaller than she ever had. When morning came, she dragged herself through her usual routine. Work, sweep, ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. But as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment that evening, exhausted and confused, she saw it. A photograph, face down on her doormat like someone had slipped it under the door and it had been pushed out by the wind. Mary's hands trembled as she picked it up and turned it over. It was her, but not her as she was now. Her as a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, clutching a stuffed bear with one missing eye. She was standing in what looked like a garden, flowers blooming around her like a fairy tale. But that wasn't what made her knees go weak. Standing behind her in the photograph, one hand resting gently on her small shoulder, was Daniel. The same Daniel. Not younger, not different, exactly the same. Down to the same sharp cheekbones, the same careful eyes, even the same way he held his mouth when he wasn't quite smiling. The photograph was old, 30 years old, at least. The colors had that faded quality of pictures from her childhood, and she could see the date stamped in the corner, a year she barely remembered, from a time in her life that felt more like a dream than a memory. Mary sank against her apartment door, the photograph clutched in her fingers, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. How was this possible? Daniel looked exactly the same in this picture as he did sitting on that street corner, waiting for her every evening with his careful smile and his 2 deep questions. Exactly the same. Mary stumbled into her apartment and locked the door behind her, sliding the chain into place with shaking hands. She set the photograph on her small kitchen table and stared at it under the harsh fluorescent light, willing it to make sense, willing it to be a mistake. But there it was, proof of something impossible. Daniel had known her 30 years ago, and somehow, impossibly, he hadn't aged a day. Mary didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that impossible photograph, her 5-year-old self grinning up at a camera, Daniel's hand on her shoulder like he belonged there, like he'd always been part of her story. By morning, her hands had stopped shaking, but her heart still felt like it was beating too fast, too hard. She clutched the photograph in her jacket pocket as she made her way through the day, the weight of it burning against her ribs like a secret too big to carry alone. When evening came, she didn't bring lunch, didn't bring tea. She walked straight to Daniel's corner with purpose in her stride and fire in her eyes. He was there, waiting, always waiting. But today, when he looked up at her, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe relief, like he'd been expecting this moment. How? Mary's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't care. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and held it out like an accusation. This photo, it's 30 years old. Daniel's expression changed completely. The careful mask he'd been wearing for weeks fell away, and what remained was raw, grief-stricken, the face of a man carrying a weight that had been crushing him for decades. "That was the last time I saw you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before everything changed. I would have remembered you." Mary's hands were shaking again, but she pressed on. "I would have remembered someone like you." Daniel's laugh was hollow, broken. "No, Mary, you wouldn't." He looked down at his hands, those thin, careful hands that had accepted her sandwiches with such gratitude. "There are things you don't remember because you weren't supposed to. Things that were taken from you to keep you safe." Safe from what? From people like me. Mary felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, like the solid world she'd built for herself was cracking apart. "Stop talking in riddles. Just tell me what happened." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph in her hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with pain. "There was a woman named Eileen." He began slowly, like each word cost him something. "Your mother. She was the kindest person I'd ever known. Still is, probably." Mary's breath caught. Her mother. She had fragments of memories, pieces of a woman with gentle hands and a voice that sang lullabies, but it all felt distant, dreamlike. "She saved me once," Daniel continued. "I was young, stupid, in trouble with people who don't forgive mistakes. Your mother, she didn't even know me, but she helped anyway. Gave me a place to hide, food to eat, a chance to start over." "Where is she now?" Daniel's face crumpled. "I don't know. After everything that happened, she had to disappear. Had to send you away to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Mary demanded again, but Daniel just shook his head. "From the life she'd gotten tangled up in because of me. From money, betrayal, people who would hurt a child to get what they wanted." His eyes met hers, desperate now. "She made sure you were placed with good people, people who would love you and keep you hidden. But I tried to find you, Mary. I tried for years." Mary felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're lying." "I wish I was." She stared at him, this broken man with his impossible story, and felt her world tilting sideways. "I don't believe you." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. There were gaps in her childhood memories, places where important things should have been but weren't. A mother who felt more like a beautiful dream than a real person. Foster parents who'd loved her but never quite felt like family. Daniel reached into his jacket. Where had he gotten a jacket? And pulled out something small and golden. A locket. Old, tarnished, with an intricate pattern etched into its surface. "She gave me this," he said, holding it out. "Told me to keep it safe until I could give it to you." Mary's hands shook as she took the locket. It was warm, like it had been held close to someone's heart. When she opened it, there were two tiny photographs inside. One of a woman with Mary's eyes and smile, and one of Mary herself as a baby. The woman looked familiar in a way that made Mary's chest ache. "That's her," Daniel said softly. "That's Eileen, your mother." Mary snapped the locket shut, her emotions too big, too complicated to process. Anger, grief, hope, fear, they all crashed together in her chest like waves against rocks. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered. "I know." Daniel's voice was gentle now, like he was talking to that 5-year-old girl in the photograph. "I know it's too much." Mary stood abruptly, clutching the locket so tightly it cut into her palm. "I need to think." "Mary, wait." But she was already walking away, practically running, her feet carrying her toward home without conscious thought. Behind her, Daniel called her name once, twice, but she didn't turn around. That night, She sat on her small couch with the locket in one hand and the photograph in the other, trying to piece together a puzzle she'd never known was missing pieces. She thought about the gaps in her memory, the dreams that felt too real, the way certain songs made her cry without knowing why. And she thought about Daniel, the way he listened, the way he seemed to understand her loneliness, the way he'd been waiting for her like he'd been searching for decades. When morning came, she was still sitting there, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her small life, trying to decide whether to believe in impossible things. But when she arrived at Daniel's corner that evening, ready with 100 more questions, he was gone. The spot where he'd sat for weeks was empty. His blanket was gone, his crutch was gone, even the small indent in the pavement where he'd rested seemed to have been swept clean. In place of Daniel, there was only a gold envelope with her name written across it in expensive ink, the kind of handwriting that spoke of private schools and old money and a world Mary had never been part of. She picked up the envelope with trembling fingers, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, just a key, heavy, old-fashioned, made of the same gold as the locket. And beneath it, written in that same elegant script, "Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the car will find you." Mary stood in the empty space where Daniel had been, holding a key to a door she couldn't imagine, and realized that whatever came next would change everything. The broken man she'd been feeding was gone, but whoever he really was had left her a way to follow. Mary spent the entire next day jumping at shadows. Every customer at the diner where she sometimes picked up extra shifts looked suspicious. Every car that slowed down near her building made her heart race. The key felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, and she found herself touching it obsessively, like a talisman that might protect her from whatever was coming. By 7:30 that evening, she was pacing her small apartment, checking the locks on her door for the 5th time, when she heard it. A car engine. Smooth, expensive, the kind of purr that whispered of money and power and things she'd only seen in movies. Mary peered through her window and felt her breath catch. A sleek black sedan sat at the curb below, so pristine it looked like it had never touched a dirty street in its life. The windows were tinted dark, and she couldn't see inside, but somehow she knew it was waiting for her. "The car will find you." Her hands shook as she grabbed her jacket and headed downstairs. The driver was standing beside the car, an older man in a crisp uniform who nodded politely as she approached, but didn't speak. He opened the back door for her like she was someone important, someone who belonged in cars like this. Mary hesitated. "Where are we going?" The driver's expression was kind but unreadable. "He's waiting for you," was all he said. She slid into the back seat, and the door closed with the soft, solid sound of quality. The interior smelled like leather and cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. There was a bottle of water waiting for her, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. They drove through parts of the city Mary had never seen, past towering mansions with iron gates, through neighborhoods where the streetlights were elegant rather than functional, where money lived so quietly you could almost forget it was there. The further they went, the more unreal it all felt, like she was being transported into someone else's life. Finally, they turned through gates that opened silently at their approach. The driveway curved through manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in fairy tales, past fountains and carefully sculpted hedges, until they reached a house that wasn't really a house at all. It was an estate, the kind of place that had wings and guest quarters and staff who lived in separate buildings. Warm lights spilled from dozens of windows, and Mary could see the shadows of people moving inside, servants, maybe, or guards. She couldn't tell. The driver led her not to the front entrance, but around to a private garden hidden behind high walls. There were pathways lined with flowers that bloomed despite the season, benches positioned to catch the best views, and a small gazebo strung with lights that looked like captured stars. And there, standing beside a fountain that sparkled in the evening light, was Daniel. But not Daniel. Not the broken man she'd been feeding for weeks. This Daniel stood tall, his shoulders straight and confident. He wore a tailored suit that fit him like it had been made for his body specifically, and there wasn't a crutch in sight. His hair was clean and styled, his face shaved, his hands steady and sure. He looked like money. Old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. Mary stopped walking, her feet suddenly rooted to the garden path. "What is this?" Daniel, or whoever he really was, turned to face her, and his expression was everything she'd never seen before. Nervous, hopeful, terrified. "My name is Daniel Heron," he said, his voice carrying easily across the garden. "And I may have billions of dollars." The words hit Mary like physical blows. She actually took a step backward, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a garden bench. "Billions." The word came out as barely a whisper. "I know how this looks," Daniel said quickly, taking a step toward her. "I know what you must be thinking." "Do you?" Mary's voice was getting stronger now, anger beginning to burn through the shock. "Because I'm thinking that everything, every conversation, every sandwich, every moment I sat with you on that street, was a lie." "No." Daniel's voice was firm, almost desperate. "That was the most real I've been in years." Mary laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Real? You want to talk about real? Real is working 2 jobs just to afford a studio apartment. Real is buying day-old bread because it's 50 cents cheaper. Real is being invisible to everyone who passes you on the street." "I know." "No, you don't know." The words exploded out of her, all the fear and confusion and betrayal of the past few days crystallizing into pure anger. "You have no idea what real is because you've been playing pretend." Daniel flinched like she'd slapped him, but he didn't look away. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to struggle the way you do, but I know what it's like to be invisible." "Oh, please. Everyone who looks at me sees dollar signs," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "They see what I can do for them, what I can buy for them, how I can change their lives. But you looked at me and saw a person who needed a sandwich." Mary shook her head, feeling tears threaten again. "So what? This was some kind of experiment? Some rich man's game to see how the poor people live?" "It wasn't a game." Daniel's voice broke slightly. "I needed to remember who I was before the money, before the expectations, before everyone I trusted tried to destroy me." He gestured toward the estate around them, the gardens and fountains and impossible wealth. 3 years ago, my own brother tried to steal everything from me, tried to have me declared incompetent, tried to take control of the company my father built. I walked away from all of it, the money, the power, the comfort, because I didn't know who I could trust anymore." Mary stared at him, seeing the truth in his eyes but not wanting to believe it. "I lived on the streets for months," Daniel continued. "Really lived there, not pretending. And everyone, walked past me like I was nothing, like I didn't exist." His voice softened. "Until you." Mary felt her anger wavering, but she held on to it like armor. "So now what? You swoop back into your comfortable life and forget all about the broken man on the street?" "No." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, thick with official-looking papers. "I want you to come with me." Mary stared at the folder like it might bite her. "What is that?" "A job offer." Daniel held it out to her, his hands steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Director of Human Outreach. I'm rebuilding my company, but this time I want to do it right. I want to help people who fall through the cracks, who get forgotten, who become invisible." Mary's hands shook as she took the folder, but she didn't open it. "I don't understand." "I can't see the things you see," Daniel said simply. "I can't understand the world the way you do because I've never had to. But you've lived it. You know what people need, what they're missing, how to reach them." Mary finally opened the folder, her eyes scanning numbers that made her dizzy. A salary bigger than anything she'd ever imagined. Benefits that would change her life completely. A chance to matter in ways she'd never dreamed possible. "I don't have a degree," she whispered. "I didn't ask for one. I don't know anything about running programs or managing people or—" "You know how to see people when they're invisible," Daniel interrupted gently. "You know how to care when caring is hard. That's what I need. That's what the world needs." Mary closed the folder, her heart hammering. "This is too much. It's too fast." "I know." Daniel's voice was soft, patient. "Take all the time you need." "But Mary, this isn't charity. This isn't me trying to save you. This is you saving others, just on a bigger scale." Mary looked around the garden, at the impossible beauty and wealth surrounding them, then back at Daniel's face. The same face that had watched her with hungry eyes from a street corner, but somehow completely different now. "I need to think," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "The driver will take you home whenever you're ready." Mary turned to walk away, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Mary." She turned back, and for a moment, she could see the broken man from the street corner in his eyes. "Your mother, Eileen," he said softly. She was the first person who believed in me, who saw something worth saving when everyone else saw a lost cause. Mary's breath caught. Daniel smiled, and this time it was real, warm, the smile she remembered from those evenings on the street. You were the second. As Mary walked back toward the car, the job offer burning against her ribs and Daniel's words echoing in her ears, she realized that everything, absolutely everything, was about to change. The only question now was whether she was brave enough to let it. Mary sat stiffly in the chair across from Daniel, her calloused fingers curled in her lap like they didn't belong in a place so clean, so perfect. The private office overlooked the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, and she could see her own neighborhood somewhere in the distance. A cluster of modest buildings that looked like toys from this height. The air smelled like jasmine and citrus, and something too expensive to name. Everything here whispered of money, the kind of money that moved quietly, confidently, without ever having to announce itself. Daniel poured her tea himself, his movements careful and deliberate. His hands, once shaking and thin, were now steady, with a gold watch glinting on his wrist that probably cost more than Mary made in a year. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, accepting the delicate china cup even though her hands were trembling. "You were limping. You were starving." "I was," Daniel said, settling back in his chair. "But not in the way you think." He explained, barely. Said things that sounded like pieces of a larger puzzle she couldn't quite see. That the broken man she'd met wasn't a lie, but a layer. That he'd walked away from his wealth 3 years ago after discovering his brother Marcus had been systematically destroying the company from within, stealing from charities they funded, bribing officials to look the other way. "I had to disappear," Daniel said, his voice growing distant. "Had to become someone else entirely to understand what we'd really become. What I'd become." Mary set down her teacup, the delicate clink of china against saucer abnormally loud in the quiet room. "So what, this was a test? You play beggar, I play angel, and now you get to feel good about yourself?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she was tired of being confused, tired of feeling like she was drowning in someone else's story. Daniel flinched, but he didn't look away. "No, that's not what this was." "Then what was it?" "It was me remembering why I cared about people in the first place." His voice was soft now, vulnerable in a way that reminded her of those evenings on the street corner. "For months, I lived without a safety net, without anyone knowing who I was or what I could do for them. And everyone, walked past me like I was garbage." Mary looked down at her hands, at the permanent stains under her fingernails from years of hard work. "Welcome to my world." "Exactly." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You fed me before you knew I was anyone. You listened when I'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to another human being. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Mary crossed her arms, defensive. "It's not rare. It's just decent." "No, Mary. It's extraordinary." The way he said her name, like it was something precious, made her chest tighten. She didn't trust this feeling, this warmth that was spreading through her despite her anger. "You don't owe me anything," she muttered. "But I owe you everything," Daniel said simply. From his desk drawer, he pulled out the folder again, the job offer that had been haunting her thoughts for days. But this time, he opened it himself, spreading the papers across the polished wood between them. "Director of Human Outreach," he said quietly, sliding the documents toward her. "We're rebuilding my company from the ground up, this time with a soul. I want you to be that soul." Mary stared at the papers like they might burst into flames. I sweep streets." "Exactly." Daniel's smile was gentle, real. "You've seen what no boardroom executive ever sees. The invisible people. The ones who fall through the cracks, who get forgotten, who become statistics instead of human beings. You don't just feed people, Mary. You see them." She opened the folder with trembling fingers, scanning the details she'd been too overwhelmed to absorb before. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Programs for the homeless, job training for people who'd been written off, housing initiatives that actually seemed designed to help rather than just look good on paper. "But I don't have a degree," Mary said, the same objection she'd raised before. "I didn't ask for one." Daniel's voice was firm. "I asked for someone who understands what it means to be forgotten. Someone who won't lose sight of the people we're trying to help when the numbers get big and the meetings get long." Mary's throat tightened. She wasn't used to being chosen for anything. Her whole life had been about making do, about being grateful for whatever scraps came her way. The idea that someone would seek her out, would value something about her that she'd never even considered valuable, was almost too much to process. "I'm not a charity case," she said, but the words lacked conviction. Daniel leaned back, his expression serious. "This isn't charity, Mary. I've been watching you for weeks, not just feeding me, but the way you interact with everyone. You nod to the homeless veterans outside the grocery store. You know the names of the cashiers who work the night shift. You leave water bottles in places where people might need them." Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's just human decency?" "Exactly." Daniel smiled. "Do you know how many executives I've met who couldn't tell you the name of their own secretary? How many board members who've never spoken to the people their decisions actually affect?" Mary sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. "This is too big. I wouldn't know where to start." "You'd start the same way you started with me," Daniel said gently. "One person at a time. One sandwich at a time. One moment of seeing someone as human instead of a problem to be solved." The room fell quiet except for the soft tick of an antique clock on Daniel's desk. Mary stared at the job offer, at numbers that would change her life completely, at a chance to matter in ways she'd never dreamed possible. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Good." Daniel nodded, but there was relief in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. Just know this isn't me saving you. It's you saving others, on a scale that actually matches the size of your heart." Mary stood, clutching the folder against her chest like armor. She felt displaced, like she was floating between two worlds and didn't quite belong in either one. As she walked toward the door, Daniel's voice stopped her one more time. "Mary." She turned, and for a moment, she saw him as he really was. Not the billionaire in the expensive suit, not the broken man from the street corner, but someone caught between both worlds, trying to figure out how to be human in the middle of it all. "Your mother, Eileen," he said, his voice soft with old pain. "She used to say that kindness wasn't about having enough to give. It was about giving anyway, even when you didn't." Mary's breath caught. She could almost hear those words in a voice she barely remembered, a woman who felt more like a beautiful dream than a real memory. Daniel smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You were listening, even if you don't remember." As Mary left Daniel's office, the job offer burning against her chest and her mother's words echoing in her ears, she realized she'd already made her decision. She just needed time to be brave enough to say yes. 6 months later, Mary stood in the same spot where she'd first met Daniel, but everything had changed. The cracked pavement was still there. She'd fought to keep it that way, despite the city's offers to repave. Some things, she believed, should stay a little broken to remind you where you came from. But now there were flowers lining the sidewalk, planted by local kids as part of the community garden program she'd helped design. Benches sat in the shade of newly planted trees, and a small shelter at the corner provided water and basic supplies for anyone who needed them. Mary had kept her promise to herself. She'd started small. One person at a time, one sandwich at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. But small had grown. The Heron Foundation's Human Outreach Program now operated in 12 cities, employing over 300 people, most of them formerly homeless, formerly invisible, formerly written off. They ran job training programs that actually led to jobs, housing initiatives that actually provided homes, and support systems that actually supported. Mary had hired Marcus from the bread shelter to run the food distribution network. She'd hired Jennifer, a woman she'd met living under a bridge, to coordinate housing placements because Jennifer understood what people actually needed in a home versus what looked good on paper. Every person she brought onto her team had lived the problems they were trying to solve. And Daniel? Daniel had kept his word too. He'd rebuilt his company with Mary's programs at its heart, not as an afterthought or a tax write-off, but as the central mission that drove everything else. He'd testified against his brother in court, helped recover millions of stolen dollars, and quietly revolutionized how corporate philanthropy actually worked. But the best part, the part that made Mary smile every morning when she woke up, was that they'd become friends. Real friends. The kind who argued about budgets and strategy, who called each other out when they were being stubborn, who sat together in comfortable silence when the work got overwhelming. The kind of friends who'd started with a sandwich and built something that mattered. Mary was checking on the community bulletin board when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Daniel approaching, no longer in expensive suits but in jeans and a simple sweater, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like he belonged in this neighborhood now. "Morning meeting?" he asked, offering her one of the cups. "Just making sure everything's working." Mary accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that he'd remembered exactly how she liked it. A small kindness that meant more than he probably knew. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the street come alive around them. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner apartment was tending to the flower boxes. A group of teenagers was gathering recyclables for the job training program. An older man Mary didn't recognize was sitting on one of the benches, reading a book he'd probably gotten from the free library they'd installed. It was ordinary life happening in an extraordinary place, a street that had been forgotten but was now very much alive. "The city council approved the expansion," Daniel said after a while. Mary nodded. They'd been working for months to get approval to replicate their program in the industrial district, where unemployment was highest and resources were scarcest. "When do we start?" "Next month." "But Mary," Daniel's voice carried a note she hadn't heard before. Nervous excitement, maybe. "There's something else." Mary turned to look at him, recognizing the expression on his face. It was the same look he'd had that night in the garden when he'd offered her the job, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "What is it?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter, the paper soft with age and handling. "I found her." Mary's heart stopped. "Found who?" "Eileen. Your mother." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mary grabbed Daniel's arm to steady herself, coffee sloshing out of her cup and onto the pavement. "She's alive. She's alive." Daniel's voice was gentle, careful. "She's been living in Oregon under a different name, working as a nurse at a rural hospital. She's been looking for you too." Mary's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. "Does she know about all this?" "I sent her newspaper clippings. Articles about the foundation, about what you've built." Daniel smiled, and Mary could see tears in his eyes too. "She said she always knew you'd find a way to feed the world." Mary laughed through her tears, a sound that was half joy and half heartbreak. "When can I see her?" "Whenever you're ready." "She's been ready for 30 years." Mary looked around the street that had become the center of her world, the place where everything had started with a simple act of kindness. The cracked pavement, the flowers, the people who'd found home here because someone had finally seen them. "I want to bring her here first," Mary said. "I want her to see what grew from what she planted." Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. She'd love that. As they stood there together, surrounded by the quiet miracle of lives being rebuilt one person at a time, Mary noticed something that made her heart skip. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, was sitting alone on one of the benches. Her shoes were worn, her clothes a little too big, and she had the careful, watchful expression Mary recognized from her own childhood. The look of someone trying to be invisible. Without thinking, Mary walked over and crouched down beside the bench. "You hungry?" she asked, pulling a wrapped sandwich from her bag, a habit she'd never broken, even with all the changes in her life. The girl's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. "Why?" Mary smiled, the same smile she'd given Daniel all those months ago. "Because that's what people do." The girl accepted the sandwich with careful hands, and Mary settled beside her on the bench, not pushing for conversation, just being present, being human. Daniel watched from a distance, and Mary could feel his smile without having to see it. This was how change really happened, she'd learned. Not in boardrooms or through policy papers, but in small moments of recognition. One person seeing another person and deciding they mattered. One sandwich at a time. One street at a time. One heart at a time. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those small moments grew into something big enough to change the world. Mary looked up at the street sign the city had installed 6 months ago, the brass plaque gleaming in the morning sun, Mary Heron Way. It still made her laugh. The same cracked pavement, now lined with hope. Her street. Her way. And this was just the beginning.